Hi, my name is Ellery Biddle, and I'm on the staff of the Center for Latin American Studies here at the university. And I'm introducing Xochitl Bada, who is an assistant professor of Latin American and Latino studies at UIC. Professor Bada received her PhD in sociology from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the civic, cultural, and political participation of Chicago-based Michoacano migrant hometown associations. She is also a co-principal investigator of the Latino Immigrant Civic Engagement Project, which is coordinated by the Woodrow Wilson Center and sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. And she is here to talk with us about the transnational political agenda of Latino immigrants.
Thank you very much to the Center for International Studies and the Center for Latin American Studies and all the institutions at the University of Chicago who made this effort possible. I believe it's very, very important that we academics do dissemination, so this is an opportunity for me to try to translate the work I do and share it with very important audiences such as those who are here today. And I want to take off a little bit from where Oscar left. When Oscar left, he was mentioning that he was recently invited to the Global Diaspora Dorners Network, which are the latest initiative from the State Department to be in DC in the kickoff campaign or the launch of this brand new initiative where the government of the United States is trying to incorporate all these diasporas that are important donors and to have them be more active participants. And he was very disappointed to see that there were very few Mexicans were in attendance. I also want to share that I was also invited, and when I saw the list that there were no Mexicans represented, I decided I shouldn't go, and I didn't go. So I don't know how it ended up being this new initiative, but I want to share with you the context of how these donor initiatives that have been formalized by migrants themselves to increase their possibilities of representation, of self-representation in the US has happened in the last 2 decades or so. And since this is a very vast arena to talk about, this is like a very tall order to talk about transnational political agenda of Latino immigrants, I will focus more specifically on one case study, the one that I'm most familiar with, which is the case of hometown associations and federations. And of migrant-led hometown associations and federations. And before going more into the detail about political engagement, I want to make clear here that I'm not only going to talk about political, meaning electoral engagement, but more broadly as civic engagement. Because as you might imagine from Oscar's remarks on how the situation is for Latino immigrants in this country, not all of them are able to vote, because many are without documents in this country, or because they are legal permanent residents only, and they haven't had the chance or the opportunity to become naturalized US citizens. But that does not mean that they are disengaged from the civic arena. There are many ways in which the immigrants participate very actively in their communities in which they now reside. And I will say that the paradigmatic case of their engagement has been, in the last 2 decades, the hometown associations, of course, but also they organize through their indigenous identities and through their sports associations, such as soccer leagues, cultural organizations. There is the most important indigenous organization of Mexicans is in California, in Fresno, the Frente Indígena Oaxaqueño Binacional, for instance. They also work in conjunction with unions and independent worker centers for the laborers. Here in Chicago, this is a very important case, and I will share you data that we have for their participation in local school council. This is a very unique example because in Chicago public schools, local school councils, immigrants can be representatives in that organization, and they do not need to be you do not need to be a citizen. This is the only spaces where you are not asked for papers. If you want to run as a local school council representative and want to be elected in this city, you can do so. There is no requirement of citizenship for being active in that arena. So they work, well, I put some examples, such as the Workplace Project, which is an independent worker center in Farming, in Long Island and Farmingville, New York, too. They work with Líderes Campesinas, with the National Day Laborers Organizing Network, with the whose headquarters is in California, with the Coalition of Immobiliary Workers, the CIW, with the Farm Worker Labor Organizing Committee here at the Midwest, in Toledo. And so it's very vast, the arenas where they engage. They also organize through faith-based initiatives in their own congregations and ecumenical religious initiatives. In terms of the Catholics, they have this national campaign, the so-called Journey of Hope, in which many parishes have joined. And the more grassroots organizations, the most important is in New York, the Tepeyac Association's Binational Torch, for example, which is a binational initiative of relay runners. Every year, thousands of runners leave Mexico City's Basilica of Guadalupe early in October, and they run in relays from Mexico City through St. Patrick's Church in New York City. Thousands and thousands of kilometers they go bringing a message of hope and for immigrants across the country, and they go bordering the East Coast, so they traverse all the states in the East Coast until they arrive for the Virgin of Guadalupe's birthday, which is December the 12th in St. Patrick Church. They've been doing that every year since approximately 2006 or so, if I am not mistaken. They also work more and more with through their nonprofit migrant-led independent media in Spanish. I hope that you see here in the city, when you are curious walking around, the amount of biweeklies and weeklies that there are published in Spanish in Illinois, in Chicago metro area. There are many now independently owned and sometimes migrant-led radio, TV, newspapers, where the so-called digital diasporas, that they try to bring news of what's happening in their new communities to their communities of origins, and vice versa too. People organized in sending regions are doing these digital diaspora networks to bring news of the everyday lives, to connect people with technology. And also, but I will put it number 5 because that's not what all the time this happens. They sometimes work with traditional historical Latino organizations. Some examples are the League of United Latin American Citizens, the Mexican American Legal Defense Educational Fund, National Council of La Raza, and the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, NALEO. So I am not going to talk about all these spheres or all these arenas. I am only going to focus on the transnational activities of hometown associations, but I wanted to point to you that the political participation is a lot broader. It not only means electoral engagement, but it like people who do not have papers or who are legal permanent residents and cannot vote. There are a myriad of other arenas in which they become engaged. So now I want to define what we mean what a hometown association is. And hometown associations often begin as informal associations, such as soccer clubs, mutual aid societies, or prayer groups. But over time, many have not only become formal organizations, but have also scaled up to form federations that represent various communities of origin from the same sending state. Sometimes these clubs create larger coalitions, including federations of different states. Though many group migrants from rural communities of origin, HTAs are predominantly concentrated in metropolitan areas in the United States. You will see that in a second. Also known as clubes de oriundos or migrant clubs, Mexican hometown associations are among the best known migrant-led organizations. Sorry. No, what is doing? Okay. These organizations are the contemporary versions of ethnic civic organizations of Eastern and Western European immigrants of the late 19th and early 20th century, who also formed this type of organizations in Chicago, New York, Houston, Los Angeles, etc. Italians, Jews, Irish, Polish, Czechs, Bohemians had very prominent organizations in many of these cities. Within time, some evolved into Rota de Credit associations, hospitals, banks, or integrated into ethnic politics in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or ethnic unions. Today, they share the objectives with traditional American charities, such as the Rotaries or the Lions, in many of their core activities, especially in terms of development. How are they organized? They organize in 4 levels. You first have the informal group, which is formed by extended family networks, friends, and fictitious kin ties around faith, sports, Rotary credit associations, mutual aid societies, and public work committees. Because as you might know, since these migrants many times work in low-wage occupations, these low-wage occupations do not provide any welfare, any services, any possibilities for unemployment. If somebody dies in your family, if you get sick, there is no cushion for you to resort. So these migrants pull their resources together in the so-called mutual aid societies, and they give they do monthly fees, so that whenever like tragedy strikes, they have some fund to share among everybody who contributes, either for pay for a funeral or for someone is sick. So it's like emergency funds. So then the next level is when they decide to formalize a club or a committee or an association. And they usually come from the same village or the same municipality, but this time it includes family members born elsewhere, because as you might imagine, like marriages are not always happen within people from the same municipality. So for instance, if someone marries a woman, someone is from Michoacán and marries somebody from Guanajuato, and there is no organization from Guanajuato, but there are many organizations from Michoacán, the wife very likely will join her husband into participating in the activities of the husband's hometown associations. So this is how that you get like multiple levels and layers of identity. Then the next level is the institutionalized federation, when migrant members of several hometown associations from the same state, plus many sympathizers and family members born elsewhere, they join forces, especially to have the Mexican state, to hold the Mexican state accountable, and to increase their leverages and resources to make demands for services, because they believe that there is not enough that what the Mexican consulates are doing, so they ask directly to their own governments, to their state governments, to increase the amount of services that they provide for the migrants who have left these places of origin. And then lastly, they also organize in coalitions. Chicago has one of such coalitions that when they join forces, several of these federations, to make alliance for cooperations in transnational issues, or to make alliances with like-minded organizations such as NAILAC that you just recently, from the previous presentation. So to have an idea of who else, because this is not only a Mexican phenomenon, let's be clear on that. They are the most visible, but by no means they are the only Latin American immigrants who organize through this. So you have like, we have like a proxy that some academics have created of how many people is participating in this movement of being in transnational development issues. So from Ecuador, the family remittance senders in Latin America who have ever belonged to a hometown association is approximately like 10% from Ecuador, 10% from Haiti, Honduras 7%, Colombia 6%. And as Aaron said and Oscar said, it's very difficult to quantify, because when you have unauthorized population, and all these data come from surveys, and sometimes are phone surveys. Imagine that somebody you call over the phone and it's a stranger, and this stranger is asking a bunch of questions, and they want to know how much money do you send home, if you have ever participated in a hometown associations. Those are questions that it's unlikely that people are going to answer over the phone. So I myself believe that these are underreported estimates, and there are many, many more immigrants from all these countries who are contributing directly or indirectly to development in their communities where they come from. But this is the information that we have from survey data. So for the case of Mexico, where are they? You now have the hometown associations distributed in 17 states across the US, which is now representing 34% of US territory. But they are heavily concentrated in 3 metro areas: Los Angeles, Chicago metropolitan area, and Texas, in both in Houston and Dallas, because these three states with these in these metro areas get 88% of the total hometown associations. But the interesting trend is that now this distribution is including new emerging destinations in places where migrants usually were not found from Mexico, such as North Carolina, Utah, Georgia. In these places where you have very fragile organizations, you are increasingly seeing that there are many hometown associations that are popping up. And so when you see on the other side of the border how they are represented, now 17 Mexican states of origin have some sort of organized migrant representation in the United States. It's 53% of Mexico's territory. But again, the concentration obeys a lot to historical trends of Mexican migration to the US. They are concentrated largely in only 5 states: Zacatecas, Jalisco, Guerrero, Michoacán, and Guanajuato, which in combination get 60% of the total hometown associations across the US. But again, the trend from Mexico, it now includes, we are starting to see more and more states that are less historical in terms of their migration trail and more indigenous, such as Oaxaqueños, Poblanos, Veracruzanos, Hidalguenses, and people from the state of Tlaxcala are being more represented in these numbers. In the case of Chicago, we've seen a tremendous rapid increase in these organizations. The last time that the Mexican consulate shared national data was 2006, and you can see the 5 organizations that are more, the states that are more heavily represented have made important gains in the number of organizations they have in the metropolitan Chicago area between 1994 and 2006. And this is the composition by state in Mexico. In the case of the Chicago, in the consular circumscription where these organizations registered in the consulate, and there are now approximately 250 organizations, more or less, just from Mexico in Chicago metro area. So, but what do they do? In their agenda, they care first and foremost about finding a new legalization for all undocumented in the US. They also care about increasing the rates of naturalization and to encourage electoral participation, both in Mexico at the federal level and at the state level, because little by little some states have been giving back political rights to migrants, and I mean in Mexico. So they are allowing them to vote in state elections. And also they care about immigrant integration. They also do lots of dissemination. They want to educate the public on the root causes of migration through sensibilization, cultural festivities, and identity, ethnic organizations, and festivals, etc. In education, they want to improve access and opportunities both here in the US and in Mexico too. In labor, they work on worker rights and unionization campaigns. Migrant civil society, they do lots of participation and networking, not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America through their partnerships with NALAC. In healthcare, they want to improve access to healthcare and do more outreach in breast cancer prevention, in HIV prevention, all sorts of chronic diseases, diabetes, and many other diseases that disproportionately affect the Latino community. In housing, they do foreclosure prevention after the crisis that has hardly hit many Latino communities across the US. They also do workshops for first-time home buyers. And in development, both here in the US, they want to promote the small businesses and jobs creation. And in accountability, they have recently made this as part of their agendas to increase transparency and participatory budgeting. They have started working with their governments in Mexico to demand more access to information, to public records, and know how government monies are spent in terms of remittances. How remittances, whatever it's captured through taxes from remittances, how are those monies being spent? And in terms of remittances, again, they want to reduce the sending costs, which they have been very successful working in partnership with the Mexican consulates, with the consular network of more than 40 consular offices across the U.S. in demanding the companies, Western Union and others, to keep on reducing the costs for families so that making it more feasible to send more money to less costs, and increase public funds for projects that are on infrastructure and community development, to reduce the effects of neoliberal economic restructuring that hardly hit since the 1980s all their communities of origin. For that, they organize many workshops across the metro area. This is, for instance, the flyer of a workshop that they made on transparency and accountability. The hometown associations from Jalisco, Michoacán, Guerrero, and in Guanajuato, they organized in March of 2009, and they did the educational workshop to bring awareness to the community of Chicago metro area of what is it that they do, what are the challenges they face, and how they can get into meaningful partnerships with civil society in Mexico and civil society in the U.S. to create greater accountability from both governments, not just the Mexico, but also the U.S. And well, they have very good reasons for that. Look at like the amount of remittances that has increased after 1994, which is when NAFTA took effect. So look at this upward trend, and how I want you to notice how much the two economies, Mexico and U.S. economies, how much they are interconnected. At the moment that the recession hit in the United States, immediately the remittances dropped in Mexico. Because when people cannot find a job here, they are going to stay. Mexico was very nervous, the Mexican government, in 2007 and 8, because they were hoping for a massive return. They were very fearful of, well, as you know, there has been many deportations, but not in the amounts that some officials in the Mexican government were expecting for voluntary people getting repatriated voluntarily because they couldn't find a job and will have decided to go back and to establish in Mexico. That hasn't happened, and this hasn't happened because now it's not an option for many of the Mexican migrant communities to return to Mexico due to the excessive levels of violence that the government has created, unfortunately. There has been so far, everybody knows that more than 35,000 people have died in the so-called war against drugs, and many people in rural communities, especially the most isolated, have been hardly hit by these waves of violence, and migrants have been affected because of kidnappings. Not only migrants who are here, who get phone calls that they say that they are threatening to kidnap their family members who were left behind, but also migrants crossing Mexico. As you know, Mexico is a country of transit. People coming from Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras, they are getting kidnapped as the drug cartels are reorganizing in this drug war. They have diversified their systems of crime, and they are now more and more being seen in these smuggling operations, the human smuggling operations. So the situation now for many migrants here is try to organize in the U.S. where they are now. They do care about what's going on in their communities, and they will try to do their best, but they are very much concerned about becoming civically engaged here to ameliorate the effects of the current crisis, that of lack of jobs, etc. So far there hasn't been any massive voluntary returns that have happened. However, you see that there is a decrease in the amount of remittances that Mexico captures. But what is the most important program that always gets talked about when we talk about transnationalism of Mexican migrants in the U.S. is the so-called 341 program. And very briefly, I'm going to tell you the story of how this program came to be. For many years, beginning in the late 80s, when President Carlos Salinas de Gortari became president after a massive fraud in an election that was deemed very fraudulent, he had to regain confidence among broad sectors of the population. In 1988, when Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas, the leading party, the candidate of the opposition, whom many, including me, believe that won legitimately the presidency of Mexico in 1988, was a candidate, he toured the United States extensively, including Chicago. He spoke at Juarez, at Benito Juarez Chicago Public School, to thousands of people who really were hoping that something was going to change and who gave a vote of confidence to him. As you know, in 1988, migrants from Mexico did not have the right to vote in presidential elections. But in spite of those challenges, many immigrants, Mexican immigrants in Chicago and in Los Angeles decided to organize a mock election. And thousands showed up to make up booths that were scattered in Chicago and Los Angeles and other places to cast a symbolic vote. And in that election, the winner, the clear winner in the mock election in the United States was the opposition, was Cuauhtemoc Cárdenas Solórzano. Well, the rest is history. Carlos Salinas from the PRI took the presidency, the one that he was invested with the presidency, and it became a new era of trying to recover trust from migrants and try to integrate them into the social fabric. And there was a national program for poverty reduction, the so-called PRONASOL, the Programa Nacional de Solidaridad, National Solidarity. And so they had a tiny, tiny bit of money that they tried to put into the United States in a micro program that very few people know of its existence, that was called International Solidarity, in which they were offering these funds, these public funds to migrants to do a matching, to leverage those. So for every dollar that the migrant organizations in the late 1980s will do fundraising in the US, the federal government will match a second dollar through the international solidarity. But the program worked only in those cases where migrants were very, very well organized and they were ready to demand those funds from the government, which didn't always happen, and it was, in other words, very discretionary. So almost a decade ago, thanks to the lots of organizing efforts done by the hometown associations from Zacatecas in California and from Guerrerenses, Michoacanos, Jaliscienses, and others here in Chicago, they put a lot of pressure on the federal government, taking the window of opportunity in 2000 when a new presidency was inaugurated after 70 years of one-party rule. They decided to push the government to inaugurate a new program that was not going to be discretionary, that was going to be written by law, and that was going to be part and parcel of the national development program of the country. And this is how the official birth of the 341 program, in which any organized group from any migrant community coming from Mexico that was here in the US or in Canada also could demand matching funds for their communities of origin. But as you saw, there are lots and lots of remittances, and there are billions of dollars that Mexico has received. Many academics have counted that Mexico has received in excess of $50 billion historically as concept of remittances not in the last decade, but many years back. But then they just do not get transferred into community development projects for the communities that needs them the most. So as you see, the federal investment that was done for this program that migrants demanded a lot was just $10 million. In 2008, the program increased to $22 million, but this budget represents less than 1% of the total public investment that Mexico does for development. So these are tiny, tiny bits of money. And thanks to new research that was actually sponsored by the National Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean Communities, we now know that for every dollar collected in VAT income captured from expenditure of remittances, the Mexican government only contributed 3 cents on the dollar in 2008 for this program. So yes, it looks impressive because if you count almost the first decade of the program, 13,599 projects have been completed, but only 4% of those projects are productive investments. Those that are going to really attack the root causes of migration, the ones that are going to generate long-term employment, long-term investments, only 4%. Because the rest, as you will see in a graph later, are mostly for basic infrastructure, from the very basic needs that are basic for any human being in this development, such as water, electricity, irrigation, etc. Those are the bulk of the project. And also, this is heavily concentrated in the three states where the Mexican immigrants are very clustered, which is California, Illinois, and Texas. But the program has had the unintended consequence of getting migrants very well organized. Because the first step that they gather is, okay, let's gonna do something for my community. Let's do a water well. Let's do an electrification project. But after a while, they become engaged in many other things, such as worker centers, unions, naturalization campaigns, get out the vote campaigns, many other things that have a lot to do with here in the United States. And then this is how you can see the program with a very critical eye in Mexico. But I also want to share with you how does the program look in terms of the aid for development that is sent from the United States to Mexico. Well, in general, United States government support for Mexican development program is very scarce. USAID, which is the United States Agency for International Development Agency, the so-called USAID, offers most of the budget that goes to Mexico for the Mérida initiative, which mostly goes to drug war. And to give you an example how these numbers look like in terms of how much money the United States invests in development in Mexico, in 2009, Mexico received $11 million in assistance from development, in assistance for development from USAID, which is the equivalent of 0.01% of the total assistance coming to Mexico from the US. So you might ask, what is the other more than 99% goes? To the Mérida initiative, which is basically to drug war. So all the money, which are like millions and millions of dollars that the US is investing in Mexico, is just for drug war. Very, very few dollars go to development. Another agency that you might be very familiar with is the Inter-American Foundation, the IAF, a very important government-supported agency. That agency, in the same year for Mexico, 2009, offered $1.8 million for Mexico in poverty reduction programs. But let's compare it to what the organized migrants in the United States, just from Mexico, have been doing. For the same year, organized migrants invested $33 million in collective remittances through infrastructure development for their communities of origin. So, and then 2 years after the 2009 numbers, which are $33 million that migrants put together there in lots and lots of hometown associations, the Department of State decides to launch the Global Donors Network. But as Oscar mentioned, the very few Mexicans were represented in this new network. So there are very slow steps. It's little by little that Mexicans have tried to gain their voice and to do dissemination on what is it that they've been doing in this. Sorry, this is not moving. I don't know why. Okay. So, see, what is it that they've been doing mostly? 37% goes to urbanization of all these projects. That it's been almost a decade since the 341 program has been inaugurated. So this is a compilation of the more than 13,000 projects that I told you recently about. So this is exactly what they do. 37% goes to urbanization, 5% to roads and highways, 25% to water, sewerage, and electrification. Very few projects go to really addressing the root causes of migration. But among these few, you have some hope in the, for instance, the greenhouses, the tomato greenhouses that have been done with investments from Joliet and Chicago here in Illinois. In the municipality of Santa Ana Maya, this is one project financed with 341 federal matching funds with organized migrants from Rafael and Sitio, two communities in Michoacan, who now live in Chicago and Joliet. Another example you have here is some benches and basketball court in Las Cruces in the municipality of Churincio. This photo was taken in the summer of 2004, but this project was made actually with international solidarity funds late in the 1980s. And as you see, these public benches, and they care about having their mark in their communities, like the being present in the absence. So the bench says that this bench was donated by the family of Luis Sendejas, who now live in Blue Island, Illinois, the zip code 60469, and this bench is in Las Cruces, a tiny community who has 300 families in the municipality of Churincio. And you see, there is not money for maintenance or for keep up. This picture that you're now seeing was taken also in the summer of 2004, and this was a project that was a park. But they put the money for the park, and then the government does not take care of the maintenance of like keeping up with having it in good shape. So look, the sign is almost fading, but what it says is that in the municipality of Ecuandureo, in the municipality that ran from 1996 to 1998, this project was paid with funds from residents from Chicago and with with public funds from the municipality. So, but besides doing these infrastructure projects that they are every time like telling the Mexican government and they need to do more, because now that they have been able to represent themselves and to conduct their own research, they now know that the money that the government is investing is tiny, is really is insignificant, considering that the amount of family remittances that just for the case of Mexico are $24 billion on average, this not counting the recent drop. So, but they do many more other things besides that. So the local networks that they have created, let's just focus here on the case of Chicago. Where else you can see that these members of the hometown associations are doing these several multiples arenas of engagement. So those leaders, these migrant leaders, you see them in local school councils. In a recent count that my colleagues and I conducted from the last names of the local school councils in Chicago, we found that more than 1,300 Latino last names were present out of like almost 600 members, which is 22% of the total of local school councils. They also participate in organizations such as Mujeres Latinas en Acción, 80 Neighborhood House, Casa Michoacán, Chicago Cultural Alliance, Illinois Art Council, Perro in Pilsen, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, Enlace Chicago. They work with the Hispanic Ministry of Chicago Catholic Archdiocese, with universities such as DePaul, OS, UIC, Resurrection Project, and also like through their soccer associations. This is very interesting because this is many times the first time when the immigrants come together are through like matches to these cascaritas, the soccer games. They get to know how many members of their same village are together. So after forming a soccer team, after the soccer teams comes like the public reconstruction of their churches or their water wells or the electrification, and then it comes civic engagement. This is more or less the order, or sometimes goes simultaneously, of becoming engaged in their local school council, in their block clubs, in their beats, in their Chicago Alternative Policing, the CAPS initiatives in many communities, and in many other areas of engagement. And politically, they are also well organized. Please don't get confused that these HTAs, those who are 501c3s, not many are, but they have created independent independent political organizations, because you know that 501c3s are prevented from direct engagement in politics in the U.S. It's against the law. So they are very well aware that this is an issue. So they have decided to create parallel organizations or become engaged with multiple identities in multiple arenas, and they do try to get in touch to us as constituents with the Democratic Party, with the Republican Party. Many hometown associations have been able to get a special discretionary program sponsored by Senator Mark Kirk, in which many of people that in their constituents, before he was a senator, he had in the 10th district where he was a congressman, he found out that many of his constituents came from 4 municipalities in Mexico. So thanks to the relationship that the many hometown associations had with their staff, they convinced him to inaugurate a special program in which they try to reunite grandmothers with their grandsons here in Mexico, here in Chicago metro area, with a 30-day non-renewable visa. And for some reason, it's very hard to find out in the mainstream media, like English media, more details about this program. And I myself have tried to find out more like transparency of how this program is run from a Republican congressman, because this is the only thing we know, that this is a congressman who is like focusing on this special visa program for grandmothers from 4 municipalities in Mexico. And there is not much information even in Capitol Hill on how this program is run. So this is also that some other organizations who have not been benefited by this program also want to try to find out how this program is working. But so it tells you how savvy, politically savvy these organizations have done to try to make do with the little resources they have to try to find ways in reuniting families, even for these very minimal programs in which like these visas are very restrictive because you can never renew them, and these grandmothers get the special visa for staying 30 days in the U.S., and they immediately need to leave the country. That's all what it is. But everybody now have this idea that this congressman has been very nice to them because he has been instrumental in getting this for them. And in the case of Mexico, they have also chapters, local chapters of the Mexican National Action Party, and there is a local chapter of the Mexican Party of the Democratic Revolution. And actually, the PRD has been very good in having more than one chapter in Chicago metro area. There is a PRDistas in Aurora. There is a PRD in Joliet, PRD Chicago, PRD Melrose Park. They have several chapters here. The PRI has one umbrella organization called Vanguardia Migrante here. There is also the Michoacanos have their own political arm called the Binational Michoacano Front. There is there's another political umbrella, the International Coalition of Mexicans Abroad, whose main objective is to improve access to absentee ballots, because now Mexicans can vote in presidential elections. By the very first time they've been able to do this, but it was very restricted because this political right was given only to those who had a valid voting card at the moment of the election. And as you may imagine, for people without authorization who came here 20, 30 years ago, they either lost this voting card or the voting card that they have is no longer valid because voting cards in Mexico have an expiration date. So in practice, this devolution of political rights was done for a very tiny sector of the population, those who had the ability to pay a round-trip plane ticket to be able to register to vote in Mexico, because that's the only way that you can vote absentee. If you go to your municipality and you stay in line, you register to vote, you return to the US, and then wait 3 months. And you need to pay a second plane ticket. And then you return after 3 months, wait, and you again stand in line, you get your voting card, you return, and wait for the elections to happen. So imagine what type of right is this that is only given to those who have money to pay. That's a democracy in which only the few who have access to the well-to-do class. So at the end, out of a pool of 4 million potential voters that the Federal Electoral Institute estimated that were eligible to vote in Mexican federal election, only less than 40,000 cast a vote. which honestly to me is a lot of people, because considering all the hurdles that you had to jump to be able to vote, the fact that almost 50,000 registered, but for some trickery that the Federal Institute made, many of the votes were deemed invalid for reasons that have still not been very transparent, but not all of those who registered were able to be able to really cast their vote. So it's been complicated for them. So this coalition, basically, that's what they do. And they also work very actively through 6 representatives in Chicago through the Institute for Mexicans Abroad, which is an advisory board that was set up by the Mexican government through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in which this, depending on your consular representation and how many people from Mexico live in the specific consular representations, you have from 1 to 7 or 8 representatives. So especially in large cities in the US, they have instituted direct elections for electing these members. So elections have been held in several places in Chicago to cast a vote for who do you want to be your representative in the United States to represent you in the Mexican government through this Institute for Mexicans Abroad. This is another experiment that has worked successfully, but they also work in coalitions and networks and transnational advocacy organizations. They also work with the March 10 movement that were largely responsible of 2006 immigrant mobilization, in which thousands and millions of Latin American immigrants went to the streets pacifically, orderly, trying to demand legalization for all undocumented, especially saying the very important message that they were not criminals, that they were workers. Those were the most important slogans that you saw in those marches. We are workers, we are not criminals. Why you are demonizing us when the Sensenbrenner bill came to pass in Congress? They work with NAILAC, they work with their coalition through CONFEMEX, the Consulate Network too, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights, the Policy Forum, and in Mexico with organizations such as Iniciativa Ciudadana, etc. And they also work with donors, banks, and labor organizations that have supported them through in the last 2 decades. But please, don't get confused. Considering the amount of money that many other traditional organizations that do not do any transnational advocacy work, the amount of money that these organizations have received to increase their capacity to become more mature and more professionalized has been tiny. If you analyze the record of how much money has been put in the advocacy organizations that only work on national or local policy arenas, it's the money that the hometown associations or the transnational advocacy organizations receive from major large donors pales in comparison when you see the amount of money that, let's say, National Council of La Raza or MOLDEF or LULAC or any other those very large, very visible organizations have received. But what are the challenges in the United States, like in the citizens' minds, and again, thinking about how we can see, or how can we frame transnational agendas in a positive way? Most people that are not familiar with the migration phenomena, it's very easy to say things such as Mexican immigrants should pay more attention to politics here where they live. People think that transnationalism is close to bigamy, or people is gonna be disloyal for some reason, or they are not gonna be engaged because their mind is fixed on reading the newspapers of what's going on in their communities of origin. But this is not true, because myself and other academics have documented how many arenas of participation people who are members in hometown associations are doing. They are capable of doing both. They have the expertise of engaging in the new communities where they live through their grassroots organizations, and they also have the expertise because they live there. They came of age in these rural communities, so they know the needs and they know how to address the problems of rural Mexico. And they also tell very often, the people who listen about dual nationality, voting abroad, etc., that Mexicans should invest their money here in the United States. But very few people know that low-income immigrants earning less than $20,000 per year invest 82% of their income to sustain themselves in the US. So, For those who are very concerned, oh, Mexico is receiving $24 million in remittances. This money should stay here in the United States. If these people want to be here, they should invest all their money here. Let's count differently, because more than 82% of the income of low-wage earners stays here to increase the wealth here. Goes to Social Security, the unclaimed accounts, go to pay taxes, go to pay rent, go to pay food and lodging and all services to pay for the school of their kids, etc. So it's not that this money that I just told you and you saw all these projects is not done with the vast majority of the income. It's like if people like participate in the Rotaries, and they participate in the Lions, and they participate in many other charities, and I have never heard any negative comments to anybody that participates in the Rotaries. Oh, being a Rotary International member is great. Oh, but being a member of a Hampton Association is not so great because these people is disloyal. So what about the people who participate in the Rotaries? Are those disloyal because they want to help Africa? It's exactly the same. In people that have been so marginalized for so many years, it's only natural that the first thing that they want to invest, or that their charity or their donation will go, they will go to their own communities, because they think that this is the people who are going to benefit the most. And again, it comes to the question of, oh, Mexicans will never assimilate, because if they keep thinking on Mexico, like going back and like voting, they will never assimilate. Well, let me tell you that this is not true, because Mexicans, since the mobilizations of 2006, have been steadily catching up in naturalizations, and you will see the trends in a second. Also, we think there has been not like enough research done on this, but in every place where you had like a large concentration of Mexican Hampton associations in 2006, you found a very large demonstration in the spring of 2006 when thousands of immigrants came to the streets to protest. We found that in the vast majority of cities with a hub of Hampton associations, you had a very large demonstration. We are not talking about correlations because we haven't had any resources to do serious research on that. But at least we know this much. There might be, like Hampton associations are triggering other types of civic engagement that have to do with what happens in the US. There's a picture of them, like CONFEMEX, the Confederation of Mexican Federations, in a massive march here in Chicago on March 10. So, but what are the barriers to naturalization? First, as you know, increased application fees. So it's very easy to say, oh, Latinos do not naturalize, they do not want to. But it's not that they do not want to. It costs a lot of money to pay for the exam, for the classes, for the application fees. New exam went into effect in October last year, and then also there are new backlogs that are rapidly increasing, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the backlogs. Lower educational attainment and literacy levels compared to other ethnic groups. Compared to like previous immigrants from Western and Eastern Europe, Latin American immigrants come to the US with relatively lower levels of literacy, which makes a challenge for passing the exam because they are not literate in their own language. So there is also lack of information about dual citizenship law. So many people is afraid if they become US citizens, they will lose citizenship rights in Mexico, which is not true. But the Mexican government has done a horrendous job, like doing dissemination about the changes of the law that happened in 1997. So very few people understand the details on that. There is a dilemma also of returning to countries of origin, the persistent dilemma, oh, should I return? Do I need to return? Will I return? Everybody thinks that they just came here to buy like a refrigerator or a car, or they came here to buy a new harvest for next year to be able to pay for the seeds. And after 20 years, they keep saying, well, I just need one more TV and then I'll go back. So this keeps on repeating, like every year they get a new goal that makes them stay, and they postpone the return for 1 year, so that it's a never-ending cycle too. And there is a backlog in English of as a second language lessons. I didn't bring the numbers with me, but just in Illinois, there are a lot more students trying to get it. There are lots of more people interested in taking lessons than there are spots available. The waiting lists are huge. It's not that people do not want to become fluent in English. It's there aren't that many resources. The United States Citizenship Services admitted that like 3 or 4 years ago they inaugurated. See, they understand that there are not enough resources and there is not enough money to pay for adult English as a second language courses. So what they've done is they put a new website where they do these English as a second language lessons for free. But as you know, the digital gap for Latinos is larger than for whites. So like Latin American immigrants have less access to the internet than other ethnic groups. So like putting classes in the internet, this is not going to solve the problem. They need to have more traditional programs, and this is not happening. There is no coordinated government effort sponsored to make legal permanent residents be citizens. There are no immigration programs that are coordinated by the government. The last time there was something similar to that was when IRCA passed, the Immigration and Reform and Naturalization and Control Act of '86, and then President Reagan invested, some say that along the lines of $4 billion were put into like community organizations to integrate, to invite people to become first to be residents, to legal permanent residents, and then become citizens. There has never been any similar effort, and IRCA happened in 1986. So there is no concentrated or coordinated effort. And there is also fear and anxieties over immigration records, and there are highly complex bureaucratic process, because what if you one day ran a stoplight? Or what if you had a driver under the influence ticket? Those things can like trigger deportation now, because they are so, like we have this 1996 anti-terrorism law and the Illegal Immigration Act and things, that it's increasingly difficult to have like this scrutiny, to pass the scrutiny of all these immigration officers that are now inspecting every document. That creates lots of anxiety among many communities who had one day they did something as simple as running a stoplight. But we see opportunities too, because dual nationality and citizenship in many Latin American countries, we now find that is actually having a very positive effect. The fact that many Latin American countries are giving back political rights is encouraging people to become United States citizens. Because one of the reasons they didn't want to become citizens is because Latin American countries were very jealous of their citizenship laws. They asked exclusivity of citizenship laws. So they couldn't have access to that, but now it's possible for them. And this recession and immigration restrictions are reducing circular migration. National media coalitions are implementing successful campaigns. For instance, the Diaspora campaign, sponsored by Univision and Naleo, has been very successful. Immigrant mobilization has happened towards comprehensive immigration reform. New citizens are likely to convince others to apply to citizenship. New naturalizations had a visible impact in 2008 presidential elections. Increased political competition attracts interest to participate in elections, and some states are becoming interested in sponsored naturalization campaigns, such as Illinois and New Jersey. The National League of Cities recently launched an immigrant incorporation initiative too. And I'm gonna finally, since we are running out of time and I wanna hear your questions, I only wanna show you the backlogs and how are we seeing changes. So these are the estimated legal permanent residents eligible to naturalize nationwide in millions between 2002 and 2006. You see the national totals in the first row, and then you have Mexico, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Cuba. You see those who are, if they want, tomorrow, they can start the process of becoming citizen. And this is how they've been faring in between 2007 and 2008. So it's living up to the promise of 2006. When they marched, they said, today we march, tomorrow we vote. And in many places, for many nationalities, this is actually happening. We see a rapid increase. And now you have the Mexico ranked for the fiscal year 2008, number first in the volume, in the total volume of naturalizations. And let's go finally to Chicago. And here you see Mexico is leading the statistical incorporated area of the Chicago metro area that includes Chicago, Naperville, and Joliet for solidly between 2005 and 2008. Mexico, then it goes Ecuador, Guatemala, and Colombia. And Finally, something very interesting that I see in these numbers, when you check on the gender differences, women are catching up at slightly higher numbers than men. So for this metropolitan area, you have higher rates in absolute numbers of women deciding to become naturalized citizens, in a little bit higher numbers than males. And they keep marching. Every year, there's a new march trying to fight for legalization and worker rights and labor rights and human rights for all immigrants as a way of putting pressure. So it's not only like trying to increase naturalization and get out the vote campaigns, becoming candidates themselves, etc., but they are also marching, and they do lots of dissemination. This is the latest dissemination they did last week, sponsored by NAILAC in Casa Michoacán, the Educational Forum of Obama and the Future of Immigration Policy, that was organized by NAILAC in Casa Michoacán, in which Oscar was also a presenter. So they do community fora all the time to try to keep the people informed on how they can become civically engaged. And so I turn now to hope to hear your questions or comments. Thank you. Okay, he asked if the hometown associations within their agenda, they also are concerned about raising money for undocumented students. So they work on these issues in two levels. First, they give direct scholarships, regardless of immigration status. So many of the hometown associations and federations, they have their own annual scholarship program. So they give modest scholarships for college, and they, of course, they do not ask papers. So it doesn't matter who they ask, who is requesting the scholarship, they give out the scholarships for anybody. And they also do advocacy. They work a lot with the DREAM Act. So they have in their coordination, they work in committees, they do lots of committee work, and they have a committee on youth. So the committees working on youth issues, many times work in coalitions through the Latino Policy Forum, the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, with the DREAM Act. Especially now that the DREAM Act recently has been enacted in the state of Illinois, they are working with them on that. Well, since the federal government has not done any action at all since like many years, since Richard Durbin tried to put the bill in Congress, each state has decided to do what they can. So different states have enacted small versions of the DREAM Act according to their possibilities. So Illinois just inaugurated a new, very small version, not what it's expected from Congress, but at least some relief for minors. Again, I want to answer from surveys. There is nobody like who is really measuring with other mechanisms, but it's approximately 14% of all who were born in Mexico. And Chicago is unique because I hope that you know that for all Mexican origin immigrants, or no, for a Mexican origin, the population of Mexican origin in Chicago metro area is divided in terms of nativity 50-50 almost. So 47% of all those who are of Mexican ancestry were born abroad. For Orange County in LA is 33%. So Chicago metro area is very unique in the amount of immigrants from Mexico that it has. It has 47% of Latinos. Let's put it like Latinos of Mexican ancestry, 47% were born in Mexico. In Orange County, which is the largest concentration of Mexicans anywhere in the country, is just a third. A third were born in Mexico. Here, almost half were born in Mexico. So that tells you why it's so vibrant, because people have this direct connection with communities of origin. They were born there, they grew up there, and they came to the US when they're in their 20s or in their 30s. This is how connected they feel to their communities. Yes, unfortunately, very few people is working on hometown associations, let alone Polish hometown associations. But you are very right. There, at the turn of the century, Polish hometowns in Chicago were primarily interested in rebuilding their churches in their hometowns in Poland. And actually, in this university, the work of Thomas and Soniecki was were pioneers in understanding how the Polish peasant became like recognizant of its Polish identity, because mostly when they came, the Polish peasants, they had their identity of their okolika, which was their village, their place where they came from. So when they were here in the United States settling in Chicago neighborhoods, the Polish peasants realized that they had many things in common with other Polish who did not come from their same village, and this is how they became aware of this national identity of Polishness, of becoming Polish, even before becoming Polish American. Yeah, this is exactly the story of the Polish-American peasant, and I see there lots of similarities with Mexicans now, because when they started in the 1970s, the hometown associations were primarily interested, very, very similar to the Polish or the Bohemian, to reconstruct their churches, because some of them returned after IRCA in 1986 to get married, because they got papers. So now they wanted to marry in their own cathedrals, in their own parishes. So after they come back in 1988, they realized that these parishes that they knew in their childhood or in their youth, they are crumbling apart. They are literally falling apart. They are about to disappear. So they decide they are going to reconstruct the parishes first. It's very much tied to their Catholic identity. Many of these organizations had their origins from prayer groups for devotees of Guadalupe, devotees of Santo Toribio, devotees of many of the virgins and saints. But after a while, after finishing their churches and the water wells and the electrification and having this beautification of their towns, they realized that they now need to become civically engaged here in the United States, becoming naturalized citizens, voting in the local school councils, becoming active in the school of their kids, and active in many other grassroots organizations addressing issues of education, of policy, of health, and many other unions, labor rights, human rights, many other issues. That's how it has been. But of course, most of the time, people is kind of saying, oh, but they must have torn loyalties. This amounts to bigamy. How can this be? Like the Mexicans should not vote in Mexican elections because that means that they are not engaged in the United States. But this is actually not the case. Actually, some of the survey results have noticed the very few surveys that have been done on those who vote both in Mexico and the US realize that all of those who became engaged, civically engaged by absentee ballots, so one of their acts of civic engagement was voting in Mexican presidential elections, 2 or 3 years after became civically engaged in a myriad of local issues in the United States. So they are political scientists who quantitatively measure this phenomena. They are starting to find a very positive correlation of becoming active in your hometown while being an immigrant, and later on becoming active in your local issues. So one thing leads to the other. That's how it seems.